Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I am going to show you how I created the African Daisy greeting card. Now, I do want to mention that just because I made a greeting card with the artwork doesn't mean you have to. You could easily put this artwork on a wooden board if you prefer. Well, let's get started. Composition. I am burning on watercolor paper that I have secured to a rigid backing board using acid-free white artist tape. I am using the Canson Heritage brand of paper, and I don't recommend it for pyrography. The Winsor & Newton brand continues to be my favorite for burning on. I have 2 daisy patterns available on my website for this. I printed them out on standard lightweight copier paper and cut around them to make it easier for placement. Then I started experimenting with their placement on the card. My major consideration, or maybe limitation would be a better word, was keeping the flowers within the boundary of the frame that I had drawn on the front of the card. The other line marks the center of the card, and that's where the fold will be. Tracing. Coat the back of the printouts with graphite. I recommend using something in the B range. I am using compressed graphite sticks. A small piece of the stick is being held with a pencil extender, but keep in mind a regular graphite pencil will work. Place the printout graphite side down on the paper or board and secure with 2 pieces of tape. Since I am burning on paper, I am using low-tack first aid tape because it won't damage the surface of the paper. Then use a pencil or ink pen and trace over the pattern lines. I like to do a darkness check to make sure I can easily see the lines. Also, it is a good idea to periodically check and look for missing information. If you are working with paper, do not press very hard as you trace. The reason is you can emboss the paper. This means you are embedding the lines down into the surface of the paper. They will appear as white lines when burned over. Before removing a pattern, always check for missing information. I am missing the right edge of a petal. While the tape is still in place, you can drop the pattern back down and everything stays where it should be, and you can trace over the missing line. Now repeat the same steps with the second flower if you're using it. Don't worry that you're overlapping the first flower. Go ahead and trace over all the lines that you're wanting to keep. I did not trace over the stem of the flower, I just traced over the flower petals in the center. Here's how it looked after I was done tracing, and as you can see, I have some overlap on a couple of petals. Pyrography flower petals. If you are burning on paper, make sure to have a piece of the same type of paper positioned nearby. You will use this to test out the pen tip heat and do any blotting to remove excess heat. For those of you burning on wood, you should have a piece of scrap wood nearby for the same reasons. Use a writer pen tip and burn around the edges of each petal. I am using Colwood Standard Writer C pen tip for this. Start with the flower that is in front. Burn the lines as dark or as light as you want. Do not burn over the dashed lines on the petals. Now start on the back flower, being careful to only burn over the parts of the petal that are visible, i.e., do not burn over the petals on the front flower. Other than that, the process is the same. Burn the trace lines along the outer edge of the flower to whatever color you prefer. Burn over the trace lines in the center of the flower. But do not burn over the dashed lines on each of the flower petals. Next, burn over the lines that mark the location of cast shadows found on some of the flower petals. Switch to a shader pen tip and block in the cast shadows below the flower center. Then lightly burn over the dashed lines on the petals using the flat of the shader. I am using Colwood's J shader, but any shader will work, including a ball pen tip. Then burn over the dashed lines on the other flower. Again, use the flat of the shader to do so. The flat of the shader will produce a wide burn stroke that has softer edges. Right now our goal is to get all of the trace lines burned over so that the pencil lines can be erased. After all of the pencil lines have been burned over, then use a standard pencil eraser and rub over the burning to remove any residual graphite. Now that the pencil lines are gone, there are 4 things we need to do with each petal. The 4 things can be done in any order. 1. Darken up the wide bands of color burned along the dashed lines. 2. Burn over the entire petal to give it a base color. 3. Darken up the inner edge of each petal. The inner edge is the side of the petal that touches the center of the flower. 4. Darken up the outer edge of each petal. Rotate the board as needed to make burning easier. For me, burning along the outer edge on the left petals was awkward, so I rotated the board to make it easier on myself. I am using uniform strokes as my burn method. This means I am burning a band of color that does not vary in tonal value. The heat is set on my burner to get a dark tan burn result. Because of the fairly low heat setting, it takes me a number of times to reburn over the flower petal to get it as dark as I want. Besides reburning, there is another way to get darker burn results. This is done by slowing down your hand speed. The slower you move your hand, the darker the burn results will be. The opposite is also true. The faster you move your hand, the lighter the burn stroke will be. Now, speaking of darkness level, it is completely up to you how dark or light you burn in your flowers. I plan to add watercolor to my art, so I didn't want the petals to be very dark. The reference photo is in the lower right corner of the screen. Be aware, I am not trying to replicate it. I'm just using the reference for guidance on the shape and location of the cast shadows on the different petals. Other than that, I burned each petal following the 4 steps that I mentioned earlier. Something to keep in mind is that contrast controls how bowed the petal appears. If the petal has uniform color, it will look flat. If the inner edge of the petal is dark and the rest of it is uniform in color, the petal will look like it curves upward from the flower center and then flattens out. If both the inner and outer edges of the petal are darker than the center of the petal will have a bowed appearance. The more extreme the contrast, or color difference, the more bowed it will appear. There are several cast shadows on the upper flower. I burned them all to a very dark brown or black color. I used a zigzag type of hand movement to burn the one created by the flower center. Zigzags means that I am moving my hand in a back and forth direction. Since the burn strokes are very short and the lines are close together, the resulting burn stroke is very dark. The larger cast shadows were created by reburning and slowing down how fast I moved my hand. I did not adjust the heat setting on my burner. The front or lower flower gets the same 4-step treatment as the upper. 1. Darken up the wide bands of color burned along the dashed lines. 2. Burn over the entire petal. 3. Darken up the inner edge. And 4. Darken up the outer edge. And like before, these steps can be done in any order. I am using uniform strokes as my burn method. Also, As I burn, I am using the flat of the shader to get wide burn strokes that have soft edges. My burner is set to get a dark tan burn result. From there, I use hand speed and reburning to get darker results. As I work, I am mindful to keep a bit of contrast where two petals touch. I burn the lower petal a touch darker than the upper one. This is just to help differentiate between the petals. Pyrography, centers and stem. Use the writer pen tip and darkly burn around the tiny leaves that appear here and there. Then lightly burn over the leaf. Afterwards, very darkly burn around each triangular shape on the flower center. Then darken up the base or the bottom of each triangular shape. Leave the tips of the triangular shapes unburned. The darkened bases do not need to be uniform in color. I am moving my hand in a vertical zigzag motion. Or to put it another way, I am moving my hand in a up-down motion, but I leave some small random gaps here and there. If you do not plan to add color to your artwork, then I would recommend burning over the tips of the triangular shapes. Also, I would reduce the darkness of your burn by half. If you look at the reference photo, you will see that the flower centers are much darker than the petals. What I did mimics the centers more than adequately for this purpose. Burn a dark line on the stem adjacent to the flower petal. Extend the dark color down the right side of the stem. Then burn over the stem using uniform strokes and the flat of your shader. Don't worry about making the color perfectly uniform. Afterwards, create a shadow by reburning along the right edge of the stem. Watercolor. Before I started painting, I added white artist tape along the frame line that I had drawn with a pencil. Next, I used a wide brush and applied a layer of water over the paper. I am using Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors. I began by applying the lemon yellow to the background. I did not avoid the flowers, and I apologize now, my head keeps getting in the way. Next, I applied cobalt blue to the centers of the flowers. And since the paper was completely wet, that blue spread around and I did my best to try and corral it back into the center of the flower. I also tried to remove some of the color because I thought it was a little too dark. I should have left that alone because I made a mess out of it. I let the paper dry a bit and then applied a purple lake over the flower petals. I didn't dab the paintbrush directly into the paint pan. Instead, I mixed up some paint and water and applied this diluted mixture onto the paper. After the upper flower had a layer of paint, I decided it needed to be a bit darker. I added a little bit more paint to my diluted mixture and applied that to the upper flower. Something that was important to me as I worked was to make sure that the pyrography showed through the watercolor. If needed, I removed excess paint from some of the petals and brushed that paint onto other petals. Another thing I did was paint over the center of the flower. I wasn't very careful as I painted, so there are several areas where the purple extended beyond the edges of a petal. I tried to remove the color by brushing over the area with a clean paintbrush. I did the same thing with a couple of flower petals that were too dark for my liking. I only removed a little bit of the color to lighten them up. Next, I added a little Hooker's Green Dark to the stem. Afterwards, I dabbled some water-diluted intense blue, which was also labeled as phthalo blue, onto the flower centers. I extended the blue color onto the flower petals. I did this to help hide where the blue bled from the centers earlier in the painting process. Lastly, I decided to add some paint splatters. My friend, Rin Shell, taps the paintbrush on her wrist and ends up with wonderful fine droplets of paint on her paintings. I did not. I had to switch to fanning the paintbrush with my finger to get small droplets. Greeting. Now that the painting is done, I removed all the artist tape from the paper. Then I used a straight edge and a fine tip black marker and inked in the pencil line for the frame around the artwork. Next, I erased the pencil line that marked the center of the paper. Now I'm checking what color I would like to use for the greeting on the card. I will be using the Wet Looks embossing markers. This is where I messed up. I used the marker and ran out of room for my greeting. Don't make my mistake. Pencil in your greeting first. Then trace over your pencil lines with the marker. To cover up my mistake, I took a piece of scrap paper and glued it down where the greeting was. Then I penciled in my greeting until it fit the way I wanted it to. Then I used the marker and traced over it. Afterwards, I sprinkled the greeting with the embossing powder, shook off the excess into a tray, and then used an embossing gun to heat and activate the embossing powder. Here's how it looked when I was finished. The last step was to fold the card in half and then press along the seam line to get a good crease so the card would lay flat. I am using a plastic creaser. They also call them bone folders. Well, that's it for this video. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of the tutorial along with a free pattern that you can download. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Well, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you next week.